episode number 76 of The Extra Environmentalist. And next, we're speaking with Chris Nelder about stories of energy transition.
Ain't no sunshine when she's gone. She's always gone too long. Anytime she goes away.
The first story that everyone's heard a lot about is the one about fracking in the United States, how tight oil and shale gas are suddenly creating a new abundance, that it's going to turn America into an energy superpower that can compete with OPEC, that we're going to produce more oil than Saudi Arabia, we're going to be Saudi America, that it's going to change the balance of geopolitics in the world. It might even cure cancer. I'm not sure. But that's the story that we've been given for the last several years since fracking started. And really that story is one that's been very vigorously promoted by the oil and gas industry. And there's a lot of reasons that they need to promote that story. But basically, it's not true. The U.S., first of all, will never produce more oil than Saudi Arabia. We might produce more oil and natural gas liquids combined than Saudi Arabia, but not oil. And so there's a bit of a misdirection there. Second, it doesn't matter if we produce more oil than Saudi Arabia, except if you want to beat your chest about it. What matters is, does it make our economy better? Is it something that consumers can afford? And the fact is that tight oil is very expensive. It's one of the most expensive sources of new oil that we can drill for today. So fracking is not cheap. And as a result, it has produced a certain upward pressure on the global price of oil. And ultimately, I believe that's going to lead us to a point where oil has become too expensive for consumers and they start to find ways to do without it. So I'm not sure how useful that whole narrative about the new abundance in Saudi America actually is. I mean, the fact is that for the last several years, we've been told that the U.S. is already an exporter of oil and gas. I've seen this story told on CNBC, on all the major news outlets. It's not true. The U.S. is still a net importer of both oil and natural gas. And so it's this new dialogue about how we're going to suddenly start exporting a lot of oil and gas as a tool against Vladimir Putin in the Ukraine-Crimea crisis. You know, I don't know how a net importer can possibly export enough oil and gas to do anything geopolitically. So it's just sort of silly. I guess the other counter-narrative is the one of renewables suddenly taking off. And there's a lot of validity to that. Unfortunately, grid power, like oil, is a very complex subject. It's not something that very many people understand very well. It's beginning to happen in a big way in the United States, but I think really the big action in renewable growth is happening outside of the United States and Europe. It's happening in Latin America. It's happening in Asia. It's happening in Africa. In 2013, for example, China installed 12 gigawatts of solar capacity. Well, the United States had about 10 gigawatts of solar capacity in total. That's like built over all time. China installed more than that in 1 year. And this coming year, in 2014, they're expected to install even more, I think 13 to 14 gigawatts. So energy transition is happening, but in a lot of ways, it's not necessarily happening where many people think. Solar and wind, for example, still provide about 4% of global electricity supply. But worldwide, if you include hydro and biomass, that's closer to 23%. And then, of course, those are smaller fractions than the total energy supply. So it's a complex subject. There's a lot of data that you have to understand. Not very people do it very well, and most of the people in the media really do it badly. So we have these different narratives going on, and underneath all of that is the narrative about peak oil, which is still very much intact.
And we will get back to peak oil in just a minute, but another energy transition narrative is one about nuclear power, climate change, and growing energy demands over the next century. And an organization called the Breakthrough Institute has made a documentary called Pandora's Promise that really summarizes this story of energy transition to nuclear power for climate change reasons. And I wanted to play just a short clip from it to set up our next segment.
We accepted most of the basic ideas of the environmental movement. We're all going to start using renewables.
Go solar.
It really took us getting clear about how big the gap was between fossil fuels and renewables for us to take a second look at nuclear. We can have a world of 7, 8, 9, even 10 billion people that are living high energy, resource intensive, modern lives without killing the climate. And that's exciting.
What do we know about the Breakthrough Institute and the idea about nuclear power as a narrative to replace fossil fuels?
Well, I don't know that much about the Breakthrough Institute or where they get their funding, but it's very clear to me that they firmly believe that nuclear power is the only solution. And they have actively written and spoken against deploying renewable energy in favor of deploying nuclear power, claiming that renewable energy just isn't sufficiently advanced. And so they advocate for investing heavily in R&D, but not for deploying renewable energy, whereas they are absolutely convinced that deploying nuclear energy right now is the right way to go forward. And they've come up with a number of arguments to make that point, but I don't really buy it. There's been a lot of very strange arguments that they've made, and it doesn't make sense to me. First of all, the world's demand for energy very well may not quadruple. Forecast that assumes that the population grows probably to 9.5 billion people by 2050, that we all continue to grow on roughly the same energy budget that we currently live on, and a number of other assumptions that are probably not true. I don't think that we're going to reach 9.5 billion people on this planet, and I don't think that we could or should aspire to keep living on the same per capita energy budget as we do today. And there's so much that we can do with efficiency, for example, to reduce the amount of energy that we consume. And there's no reason to think that the developing world should follow the same path as the developed world did to develop their energy supplies. There's a lot that they can do to live more efficiently, to live on a more efficient energy platform that isn't as reliant on fossil fuels in particular, but also that uses electricity a lot more efficiently. And they've also made some very bizarre arguments of comparing nuclear versus solar. For example, they had an article in 2013 claiming that the cost of German solar in the German energy transition was 4 times as expensive as the cost of a nuclear plant that's now being built in Finland. But I looked very carefully at their analysis, and it was just flat wrong. They did a partial analysis of the cost of the nuclear plant based on the developer's cost estimate, which is not the right way to do it. You want to take the levelized cost of energy, which is a complex subject we don't have to get into now. And they compared that to the cost of all installed German solar from 2000 to 2011, which is a period in which the price of solar fell dramatically, which Schellenberger and Nordhaus even recognized, but they didn't recognize it in their analysis. They weighted the much higher costs of the past decade in solar, not the current costs, against the cost of a Finnish nuclear plant, which was then expected to be completed in 2016. But that nuclear plant was actually originally supposed to enter service in 2009. And we just recently learned, I don't even know if I can pronounce this, the Olkiluoto 3 reactor has been delayed again. Finland can't even give a start date now. It's going to be delayed until at least 2018. And Arriva, the developer, has taken what they call provisions, which I take means losses, of over $4 billion on this plant.
Wow.
So it was just a bizarre thing to take the accumulated cost of solar in Germany over a decade in which those costs plummeted and compare that to the cost of a nuclear plant, which isn't going to be finished for years now, which has already accumulated $4 billion in losses. By the time that nuclear plant gets online, solar is definitely going to be cheaper. And in fact, depending on how you want to look at it, it already is. An analysis based on the actual unsubsidized cost of German solar in 2016 would find that the cost is below that of nuclear power, not 4 times as expensive. And even the subsidized cost would be lower. As Craig Morris pointed out at Renewables International, he's my favorite English language observer on the German energy transition, the lowest solar PV feed-in tariff of 13 cents per kilowatt hour on Germany's sliding scale is already below the cost of EDF's proposed new nuclear plant in the UK, which is coming in at 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And Germany's highest solar feed-in tariff will soon be too, at 13 cents a kilowatt hour. For another example, look at the new nuclear plant in the UK they just signed a deal on. Comes in at 92 euros per megawatt hour when it starts, and that's inflation adjusted over like 25 years. So compare that to the latest solar plants and wind plants being installed in the United States. We just had an announcement this last week of the cheapest solar project that's ever been signed in the United States, 150 megawatts at below $50 a megawatt hour. So that's about half the price of this nuclear plant that's been proposed for the UK, which won't even be built for several more years yet. I mean, solar is already half the price of that in the United States.
So it sounds like to me that solar is the wise man's investment choice going forward. If you're to be a betting man, solar would be the way to go forward.
I sure think so. I mean, that new solar plant in the U.S., that benefits from the investment tax credit, okay, which is about 30%. But even if you take that away and the solar plant is now selling its power for, let's say, 7.5 cents a kilowatt hour, that's still cheaper than nuclear power and coal power in the United States. And it's about half a cent a kilowatt hour more expensive than gas-fired power in the United States. But if you look at the trajectory of natural gas prices over the next 20 years, which is the time frame you should be comparing, if you're talking about a solar plant or a gas turbine, it's going to be cheaper than gas too. It is going to be the cheapest power you can generate, period. And the same thing is becoming true for wind.
Why do people even consider nuclear power instead of solar?
I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, I can only speculate. On the one hand, a lot of people, I think, are carrying around mental models of renewables being this sort of toy that's really expensive. They just haven't paid attention to the phenomenal cost decrease that have happened over the past decade. So maybe their information is out of date. Second, I think some people just look at the trajectory of population and they look at the trajectory of energy growth over time, and they assume that those things are sacrosanct. And then they say, well, there's no way that renewables can scale up to meet this demand. Well, that's true. But I don't think those projections are accurate. All over the developed world, okay, so the OECD countries, we've seen electricity demand, which is what we're talking about here with nuclear and renewables, has actually been falling since about 2005. It's happened all over Europe. It's happening in the US. It's happening in Australia. And in some cases, we've actually got a problem of overcapacity, where the utilities have an excess of generating assets that aren't running often enough now to justify their expense. And so they're actually looking at a real future of potentially stranded generating assets with these big coal and gas and nuclear power plants. Exelon, for example, which is the largest operator of nuclear plants in the United States, just recently said that it would shut down some of its nuclear plants this year if the prospects for their profitable operation don't improve. In the United States, you're really in trouble trying to operate a nuclear plant now. And part of that is because natural gas is so cheap that nuclear can't compete. And part of it is because with more and more wind and solar coming onto the grid, these are power plants where the fuel is free. So once they're built, when those things are putting out power, they are able to underbid pretty much any other generating source. The most profitable part of the generating day is the middle of the day, and that's when solar is pumping out. And so the most profitable grid power which was being generated in the middle of the day by nuclear plants, is now being taken away by solar. And so it just doesn't make any sense. I think people have sort of faulty mental models of what the future looks like in terms of power demand, in terms of population growth, and I think in terms of what the real costs today and in the future are going to be for renewable power and nuclear power.
A core part of the story we were just talking about in the audio we were playing from Pandora's Promise film is this idea that we're going to hit, 9 or 10 billion people and consume 2, 3, 4 times as much energy as we do now. But one story that really counters that is the idea of geologic depletion of oil output in the peak oil story. Now reflecting back on a few years of recession and very slow growth in output for global oil companies. How is the peak oil story stacking up? Is that really what can explain this overcapacity that you're talking about in utility companies, where now the growth in demand for electricity is not really where it was expected to be?
I would really separate the peak oil story from the grid power story. There's really not that much of global oil demand is used to produce electricity. Oil is primarily a transportation fuel. So the overcapacity is really in grid power, and most of that is nuclear and coal and natural gas. But with respect to the peak oil story, it's very much intact. The story of peak oil was that as you reach sort of the peak in global oil production, it becomes very expensive because the quality of the resource base, the quality of the reservoirs, the rocks that you're drawing up the oil and gas from is now declining. You've gone through the cheap and easy stuff and you're getting down to the difficult, expensive stuff. And that's precisely what has happened. Light, tight oil and the days of cheap and easy oil ended. That growth ended in 2005. And since then, we've been moving more and more towards stuff like tight oil from fracking, deep water oil and tar sands and so on. And that stuff is very expensive and it's difficult. And it's also fraught with a lot of risk, as we discovered in the Deepwater Horizon blowout, as we discovered with Shell's attempt to start drilling in the Arctic last year. It's just problem after problem, lots of technical challenges, very risky, very dangerous. Well, that's what happens when you get into the hard, difficult stuff. And at some point, it just becomes so difficult and so expensive to try to keep your production rate growing that it flattens out. Okay, so that's what happened starting in 2012. It's grown just a little bit since 2012 globally, but most of that has actually not been oil. Most of that has been natural gas, liquids, and biofuels. And then there comes a point where no matter what you do, you can't keep increasing the rate of oil production, and it starts to fall. And that will probably be the case at any reasonable price. I mean, obviously, if the world were suddenly willing to pay $20 a gallon for gasoline, I think we could continue to increase the production rate of oil.
Yeah, right. That's not going to happen.
But that's not realistic. And so what you have to do is you have to bound the question between what's a realistic price that people can pay and what's the real cost of producing oil as you go forward. So what's happened? Capital spending, CapEx, by the world's publicly listed oil majors has increased more than a factor of 5 since 2000. But their production of oil has actually fallen back to the 2000 level after the last couple of years of very modest increases.
Talking about capital expenditures, that's maybe not a term that comes into most people's lives. What does that mean when you say that capital expenditures by these oil companies has increased by a factor of 5?
Well, I mean, there's really two ways to look at the cost of doing something, right? So the initial cost, what you spend to drill a well or to buy a house or whatever, that's the capital expenditure. And then there's the operating cost, what it costs to keep producing from that well or to maintain that house. Okay, so it's CapEx and OpEx. So that's all it is. CapEx, we're basically talking about upstream spending, midstream spending in the oil industry. That's drilling wells, doing the completions, putting together the processing systems and the transport and so on. So they've spent more and more money to try to keep finding more oil reserves and getting those new oil supplies to market. But the actual supply is just not keeping up with the explosion in costs.
So it's literally the net energy return balance going down, the energy return on money invested actually decreasing.
Yes, it is. Return on money invested, not necessarily. I mean, obviously the return on energy invested is also probably dropping, but those are different subjects and they should not be said in the same sentence. So let's not make this a conversation about EROI. It's not. It's about spending, okay? You know, the Wall Street Journal recently pointed out that oil and gas production by a couple of those majors, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Royal Dutch Shell, their production has fallen over the past 5 years, despite their spending more than $500 billion, $500 billion on new projects. Chevron's costs have jumped 56% since 2010, and their production is actually falling with all of that spending. And so it's denting the profits of these big oil companies, and their investors are starting to get very nervous. You know,
yeah, I was going to say, what do shareholders have to say about that?
They're demanding higher dividends. They're demanding share repurchases. I mean, there's really a couple of ways, if you're an oil company, to keep up the market capitalization, you know, the market valuation of your company. You can keep putting more reserves on the books. Okay, so that's basically considered money in the bank. You know, it's oil that you've found but you haven't produced yet. It's sitting underground waiting you to free to produce it. It's considered to be an asset. And that's generally, through the course of the oil industry, how they've continued to maintain their valuations. Even as they're pumping these reservoirs dry, as long as they keep exploring and discovering more to keep those assets up on the balance sheet, their valuation goes up along with the price of oil. But in recent years, they've had a harder and harder time replacing reserves. Reserves have actually started to fall. So now they've switched over to different metrics like return on capital employed and, you know, these other sorts of accounting tricks. But it's all basically trying to hide the fact that it's just getting harder and more expensive to produce oil. And so if that's the case and you can't keep adding reserves to your balance sheet to keep up the valuation of your company, is to buy shares back, put them back on the company balance sheet so that you've got a shrinking pool of shareholders, basically. So that's one way to prop up your valuation. And then the other thing to do is to just pay out more money in dividends so that you're no longer a growth company, you're now a yield company. But it's just gotten very difficult. I mean, most people, for example, think of Exxon as an oil company. Well, Exxon now has more gas reserves on its balance sheet than it does oil, because its efforts to explore and find more oil and put that on its balance sheet have just been, I won't say they've been failures, they have had some successes, but it's just gotten too difficult to keep up the valuation of the company. And so they're putting more and more natural gas and natural gas liquids on their balance sheet. Well, that's what happens when you have to leave oil behind. I mean, this is an industry in sunset. And the industry is very nervous about this. There's trillions of dollars of capital on the line. And so obviously they've been very anxious to tell the biggest possible story about fracking and incipient energy independence for the United States as a way of sort of sweeping that underlying story under the rug. And they've been pretty successful at doing that for the last couple of years. But the most transparent models that I've seen for the future of tight oil are that it is going to be back into decline in the United States before 2020. I think we've got probably 2-3 more years of modest growth in tight oil. And throughout the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to be treated to lots more stories about how peak oil was really dumb and fracking has buried the entire notion and we're going to be energy independent and all that stuff. But this is just a very temporary thing. And it's also a very expensive bump in energy production. And I think by 2020, U.S. oil production is going to be turning back down again. The thing about that is that when you're fracking, okay, what you're doing is you're going into what's called the source rocks. This is the shale that you're extracting this oil from, or this gas, is where hydrocarbons were formed. Okay, that's where ancient organic matter, plankton and so on, were compressed and cooked down over geological time, hundreds of millions of years, and turned into oil. That happened in the source rocks. That's what the shale is, it's the source rocks. So until we actually found a commercially viable way through hydrofracking and horizontal drilling to produce oil from these shale formations. We were instead producing the oil that migrated up from these shale formations and accumulated in these reservoirs above the shale. So that was the era of cheap and easy oil, was going through these accumulated reservoirs. Now that we've gone through the cheap and easy oil, now we're getting down into the source rocks themselves, the shales. And when that game is over, okay, when you've reached the maximum exploitation of your shale, of your source rocks, and that production starts to turn down again, then there's nowhere else to go. That's the end of the line.
I am a lineman for the county, and I drive the main road, searching in the sun for another overload. I hear you singing in the wires, I can hear you through the wine. And the Wichita lineman is still on the line.
One of the most crucial aspects of our energy modelling and scenario quantification is how much energy in total is the world going to use in 2050.
A lot of mega cities are going to be built in the coming decades.
We're talking about the equivalent of a new city of 1 million people every week. That is an incredible demand.
Most of the world's resources are consumed by the cities.
We understand demand will rise, so we have to, of course, find ways of bridging the gap between the demand and the supply.
Decisions that we take now are going to have a major impact on decades to come.
Traditionally, when you do forecasting, you tend to do demand-constrained forecasting. That it's demand-driven forecasting, where you start from the top and go to the bottom, and the top is going to be typically GDP growth, and then you multiply that by some coefficient to get demand growth for whatever you like, whether that's automobiles or housing, or in our case, oil. So oil demand is then a function of GDP growth with some variance, and then that in turn leads to supply growth, right? So supply follows demand. That's traditional forecasting, and if you're a forecaster or an analyst, you could spend your whole career and never use any other methodology than this. So if you say a BP forecast, this is what they mean. Everybody uses this, all the investment banks, all the oil majors, the US and foreign governments all use this. Now, what we've been using for oil and gas is supply-constrained forecasting, supply-driven forecasting. We then say oil demand will essentially be 100% of oil supply, and then the linkage to GDP is then a function of that oil supply growth. So this all suggests that we are short on oil, that oil remains expensive, and that expensive oil is preventing the economy from operating the way it has traditionally been accustomed to do so. Let's talk about the oil majors a little bit. Oil production has faltered, even as CapEx has soared. The oil majors here, just for the record, are British Gas, BP, Conoco, Chevron, ENI, Oxy, Petrobras, Shell, Statoil, Total, and Exxon. Okay, these are the primary traded public companies. So their production is exactly where it was, crude oil production is exactly where it was in 2000. In fact, it's down from where it was in 2008, 9, or 10. But their CapEx is up by a factor of 5, from 50 billion to 262 billion during that period. That's phenomenal. That means in nominal terms, the productivity of capital has fallen by a factor of 5 over a decade. Okay, that's a phenomenal unwind of an industry.
I hear you singing in the wires, I can hear you through the wire.
You are listening to Extra Environmentalist episode number 76, and we are speaking with Chris Nelder about energy transition.
It's still on the line.
Because we're talking about energy transition stories and we've just been talking about peak oil, one of the things that I hear frequently and read on blogs and the internet is that building renewables won't ever work because basically what you were just talking about in the drop off in oil production and the difficult economic consequences that will have, especially later this decade, that it's already having, but especially later this decade, would actually prevent us from building out renewable energy infrastructure. What do you have to say to that kind of line of argumentation?
I've made that argument myself. I'm very concerned about it. If we do, in fact, have global oil production beginning its decline around 2015, which has been my call for quite a few years now, and when you actually calculate the decline rates and you look at how much oil would be lost on the global market year after year after year, and then you start to think about what is the effect on the global economy of losing 5% and then 10% and then 20% of global oil production. You know, it doesn't take a huge leap of imagination to think, wow, it's really going to start being difficult to maintain a functioning economy. It's going to be hard to maintain global shipping. It's going to be hard to maintain an industry of, let's say, big wind turbines where the supply chain for the parts in those turbines might go all the way around the world. So my view has been that we should build as much renewable capacity as possible for the next 20 years while the availability of oil is reasonably good and the price is reasonably acceptable. I think once you get out past, say, 2030, 2035, it's going to be quite difficult and quite expensive to build anything or deploy anything that requires a lot of shipping or that requires parts coming from all around the world. So I subscribe to that notion. Now, some people will take this question a step further and say, well, what about later in the century when you get out to 2070 or 2080, when most of the oil is gone, most of the natural gas is gone? What about then? Like, how do you build wind turbines and solar panels and get them installed? Well, I think that's an interesting question, but the more I think about it, the more I conclude that we just don't have enough information to answer that question right now. It's formally unanswerable. There's too many questions, too many uncertainties about how people will react, what will happen to the geopolitical environment, what will happen to population, what will happen to energy supply. There's just way too many X factors we don't know. I think it's conceivable, maybe somewhat remotely conceivable, but maybe conceivable that at some point we could have an entirely, in the 22nd century perhaps, we could have an entirely renewably powered economy where we're actually able to do things like mining and smelting and manufacturing and transportation and installation and all of that using only renewable electricity as the energy source and to drive all the machines. Or maybe we'll have, some very small fraction of the stuff that we currently use liquid fuels for, that we still are able to power using some sort of biofuels. But it's just not a formally answerable question. And I've batted this question around a lot, especially with people who are literate on the EROI question. What's the EROI of these renewable fuels? Can you run a civilization on them? And I've looked at these studies on solar and on cellulosic ethanol, other kinds of biofuels and wind and so on. And I just don't think they're conclusive. I've got so many issues with these analyses. I don't think it's possible to really be terribly conclusive about what it all means. One thing I do know is that we have to build as much renewable capacity as we possibly can in the next 20 years while oil is reasonably available and reasonably priced.
One thing that I have seen recently is Stephen Koppitz gave a really nice presentation on the difference between demand models and supply models. And you were talking earlier about the kind of defective models that we're using to make energy decisions, especially in these stories that back up the decision to build more nuclear power capacity. And In this presentation, and I'll link to it in our show notes so our listeners can find it and reference it and know what we're talking about. But he gets into this section about GDP growth and forecasting errors and how the typical macroeconomic models are having difficulty coming to terms with how slow growth is right now because they're using the same models they have for a long time. And Stephen Koppitz, his explanation, and I hope I'm saying his last name right, in his presentation, he's talking about how the repricing of oil that occurred in that first decade of the 21st century is really this missing factor in their models and why growth is moving so slowly at the moment. And so you were just talking about projecting out several decades and how the situation is going to get much worse. Do you think that the kind of thinking that you are putting forward there will gain any kind of mainstream traction, that the reason why the economy is growing so slowly and the reason why this whole system is malfunctioning is because of energy depletion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of a fait accompli at some point, right? Some people who understand energy and who understand economics, and that's a really small group of people. Most people seem to understand energy or economics, but not both. A lot of us really started to look at energy supply, particularly the fact that oil supply stopped growing in 2005 as a real factor in the global economic situation, that the rising price of oil, as it became increasingly difficult to produce new supply, acted as a brake on the global economy. James Hamilton did some good work on that. Quite a number of other people have looked into that question. And I think that's very much the case. And Koppitz, I don't know how to pronounce his name either. His presentation was fantastic. I think anyone could spend an hour looking at his presentation, would understand everything they could possibly need to know about the global oil supply and demand and price situation. It was just a perfect encapsulation of everything that you need to know. But one of the key things that he really brings out in his presentation is that historically, everyone has modeled future oil supply from a demand perspective. That's what the IEA does. That's what the EIA does. That's what the whole alphabet soup of agencies do. They just forecast demand, and then they say, well, there will be supply, and it'll be at an acceptable price. And that's fine while you're in over a century of continually growing oil supply that's relatively cheap. But that's not the case anymore. We've exited that era in history. We've now gotten into a supply-constrained world. So that's what his firm does. They look at a supply-based model, and it actually has given them much better guidance for what price is actually done, for what's actually happening in the global economy, and for what's actually likely to happen in the future. So I absolutely subscribe to that. Ideally, we would have very sophisticated models that would actually be able to dynamically model what the future supply of fossil fuels is likely to be, what its price is, what the effect will be on demand, what the possible substitutions will be, how geopolitics will react to that, and so on. But this is just a very complex question. And as far as I know, nobody even is close to having a good model. No one in the world has a model that's sophisticated enough to do all of that, to really provide a multivariate model of the global economy with a constrained oil supply.
I know that Germany has an interesting energy transition going on right now. Is their strategy one that might work? Or should the United States think about adopting that strategy?
I think the German model is fantastic. I've written quite a bit about it myself. They have managed to shut down most of their nuclear capacity. They're on course to phase it out entirely, while growing their renewable supply from almost nothing to 25% of their energy supply in a little more than a decade. So far, it's been a very popular thing. Most Germans support it. Most Germans want to see the energy transition continuing. Most of the solar capacity and wind capacity, I believe, in Germany is actually not owned by the utilities. It's actually owned by the public, where they buy small shares in these little solar and wind projects. So everyone's a stakeholder, and it's been highly effective. Germany does not have a great solar resource. I mean, the only part of the United States that has worse solar installation is like Seattle, but they have managed to do it. They've managed to do it at a reasonable price, and they have more solar capacity per capita than any other country in the world. So naturally, they've been the target of incumbents who are trying to fight energy transition, and their mouthpieces in the press. Over there, it's like Der Spiegel, constantly talking down the energy transition, constantly distorting the debate with sort of mistaken narratives about how it's why grid power is so expensive. Well, guess what? Most of it isn't because of the feed-in tariffs for the solar. How expensive grid power would have been without it. Their recent uptick in coal power, well, it's not really because of their phasing out nuclear, and it's not really because of their adoption of renewable power. If Germany brought its nuclear reactors back online today, it would not displace coal. It would displace gas, because gas is far more expensive than coal over there. So it's a very complex situation, but I'm definitely a fan. I think Germany is doing a wonderful job of sort of showing the rest of the world how you can, in fact, produce a large percentage of your grid power from variable sources like wind and solar. And in so doing, you can do it at a reasonable price, and you can do it without the grid falling down. In fact, Germany now has the most reliable grid in Europe. If you go back to like 1993, people were saying, if Germany ever had more than 3% of its grid power from renewables, the grid would fall over because it's intermittent and it's much too expensive and it's silly and stupid. Well, guess what? They've now got 25% of their power from such sources, and it's got the most reliable grid in Europe. But the other side of that story is that their incumbent utility industry is now in serious, serious trouble. Germany's three largest utilities, E.ON, RWE, and EnBW, are struggling with what the CEO of RWE called the worst structural crisis in the history of energy supply. They've had falling consumption, growing renewable power, which actually cut the wholesale price of electricity by 60% since 2008, which has made it unprofitable to continue operating coal, gas, and oil-fired plants. E.ON and RWE are going to close or mothball 15 gigawatts of gas and coal-fired plants in the coming years, and there's another 12 gigawatts of nuclear plants that are going to be retired by 2020.
And that's just all sunk investment costs that then has to be written down, right?
That's right. RWE is going to write down about $4 billion on those assets. The returns on invested capital of the three utilities are going to fall from about 7.7% in 2013 to 6.5% in 2015. Well, guess what? At that point, pension funds and other fixed income investors who have normally been invested in the utility industry are going to start looking at green bonds and climate bonds, which are based on renewable energy projects and energy efficiency projects, because that's where they can get at least a fairly equivalent return, but with a lot less risk. There's no risk of investing in a solar plant and then having its costs suddenly explode in the future. Once it's built, it's it. Your cost is sunk the day that it's gone into operation, and it's not going to go up again. There's no regulatory risk. There's no risk to the public. There's no chance of, what do you call a solar spill? It's a nice day. So the risk is just so much less in renewables. And if the returns from the utility industry are actually falling now to that point, we've got every reason to believe that money is going to start looking into the green bonds and the climate bond sector. And in fact, it already is. Bond issuance in green bonds jumped from $2 billion globally in 2012 to $11 billion in 2013. And this year, it's going to double. We're probably going to see another $15 billion invested in green bonds this year.
Wow.
Is there a way to catalyze this movement, this energy transition movement? Is there a way to, move away, divest ourselves from fossil fuels and move towards this energy transition more quickly?
Yeah, no, absolutely. First of all, I think divesting from fossil fuel producers is a little like trying to step on the brake of a runaway car. I mean, you might slow it down a little, but you're not going to stop it. And eventually the brakes are going to burn out anyway, and you're just going to continue hurtling down the hill. I don't think that there's any way to actually deprive the fossil fuel industry of 100% of its funding. I mean, the universities can step out, the pension funds can step out, and what happens next? Well, banks and hedge funds step in. So I don't think the divestment strategy to get out of fossil fuels is actually the right way to go about catalyzing energy transition. It's a political tool, and it's useful for organizing public pressure. And for some people who are more minded toward organizing people, that's a great strategy, and I'm not going to argue that. But I don't think that it's a way to catalyze energy transition, because that's not the way the global economy works. The global economy runs on fossil fuels, and especially oil. Oil is the transportation fuel of the world. We can't do much of anything without it today. Hopefully in the future we can, but right now we can't. So if we want to catalyze energy transition, then I think we ought to do it directly by investing in energy efficiency, investing in renewable energy production and grid development so that we can do things to accommodate higher and higher percentages of renewable power on the grid, and especially in transportation transition. The very best way that we can get off the needle of oil is to stop driving cars and trucks and switch to rail. I mean, that is absolutely the biggest possible way that we can reduce our oil consumption. So that's the first thing. And in the same way, I kind of feel the same thing about climate change. We ought to focus on what fuel we put into the engine of the world economy, not just try to stuff up its tailpipe, which is what the carbon emission strategy has been so far, the Kyoto and Copenhagen and so on. Well, of course, if you're just going to try to stuff up the tailpipe, all you're going to do is sort of back things up and create back pressure, and the engine would stop and nobody's going anywhere. Well, that's not the way to do it. You have to provide an alternative fuel. So I think that focusing on carbon emissions is approaching the problem backwards. And I would really have to say the same thing about divestment from fossil fuels. It's not enough to try to clamp down on fossil fuels and hope that the market will suddenly sort of automatically switch to renewables energy. We should directly try to switch to renewable fuels first. If we do that, then the carbon emissions problem will take care of itself, and we'll be sure that we're going to wind up with a clean economy, not just hope that it works out that way indirectly.
Possibly some of the people listening right now are either involved in the divestment movement or are wanting to divest themselves personally from fossil fuel companies. If you were to sit down with somebody who's lobbying their university endowment manager, or actually speaking to, say, a university or pension fund endowment manager and saying, here's your options for investing in renewables and in this energy transition, what would you say to them? And what are some of the new investment possibilities that are coming along to invest in renewables?
Well, I think I would probably, first of all, try to get them to understand the likely trajectories of cost for all the different fuels, to understand what energy transition means in terms of grid power and in terms of transportation, and to understand things from sort of a long-term perspective. I think, for example, Warren Buffett has been very smart about this for investing in rail and investing heavily in big wind and solar farms. I think the carbon bubble story is real in the sense that there will be a significant chunk of fossil fuel reserves that are currently on the books of producers, both the national and independent companies, that won't end up being produced. But the question is why? See, I don't think those fossil fuel reserves will wind up stranded because of carbon policy. It would be nice if the world could suddenly get its act together and put a carbon policy in place so that the market could do its thing and so on, and we'd all wind up eventually with energy transition. But I don't think the history of attempts to form carbon policy globally speak very well to that possibility. I don't think that these fossil fuel reserves are going to be stranded due to divestment either, just because there will always be other money to replace the money that's divested. I think that the carbon bubble is real, and those fossil fuel reserves on the balance sheets are potentially stranded for two different reasons. First, I think renewable energy is undercutting coal and natural gas for grid power generation, and that's happening on price alone. That's already happening now. That's what's happening in Germany. That's what's happening in parts of the U.S. It's happening all over the world. Second, oil will be stranded as the cost of production finally gets high enough that consumers can't afford it anymore. The future of oil is really a race between improving the efficiency of vehicles and the escalating cost of production. So which will win? If efficiency improves quickly enough, say if we can replace 1 billion inefficient vehicles worldwide with vehicles that are 2 to 3 times as efficient within the next 20 years, then perhaps we could adjust to the rising cost of oil production and we would just keep using it. But if the cost escalation in oil production goes up faster than we can adjust to it by replacing vehicles, then we'll simply be forced out of our cars. And most of us will switch to public transportation or other various forms of transportation that don't require oil, like walking or bicycling or electric vehicles and hopefully rail. So my bet is that it's going to be the latter. I don't think we can replace enough inefficient vehicles quickly enough to keep up with the cost escalation in oil production. So if I were going to advise a money manager on what to do, I would say reduce your exposure to potentially stranded assets. I mean, maybe they're not going to be stranded right away. Maybe that thesis doesn't actually really take root for another 10 years or so. Who knows? Who cares? If you can get reasonable returns on green bonds, which are invested in renewable energy projects and efficiency projects at basically zero risk in this environment, then I think you should allocate at least part of your portfolio to that. I think that investing in rail makes great sense because the price of oil is only going to get higher in the future, at least until it hits the limit of consumers' pain tolerance. And rail will always be a very highly efficient way to move people and freight around. And I would advise them to really look carefully at some of the creative financing that's happening right now to do energy retrofits. There are some really creative people out there that are figuring out how to replace all the streetlights in a city, for example, and actually cut the city a check for $40 million when they sign the deal. And the city doesn't have to pay out a single dime to do that swap. And it's actually going to reduce their operational costs over the lifetime of the project. I mean, it's a no-brainer. But this is the kind of efficiency stuff that we really need to look at in a serious way as an investment thesis, I think, over the next 20 years, because that's how you do energy transition, especially without expensive, risky nuclear plants that just always are over budget and always take years longer to build than you think they will and always need hundreds of billions of dollars worth of federal money in terms of insurance backstops and federal loan guarantees and handling the nuclear waste, which we still don't have a solution for. Never mind that on past trends, that global energy consumption is going to be 4x in the future. It's not. What's going to happen is we're going to improve efficiency through creative financing. We're going to stop all the thermal losses. We're going to find ways to run vehicles more efficiently and then hopefully get out of our vehicles entirely and go to rail and bicycles and small circuit buses and so on.
So aside from opening a bike store and investing in solar, what other great investments would you recommend for people in looking to invest in the future right now?
Well, if you're a homeowner, I think one of the best investments you can make is just improving the efficiency of your house. There's a lot of leaky houses out there that have little to no insulation, that have all kinds of leaks, leaky single-pane windows, and so on. There's just trillions and trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure rebuilding that we need to do in the built environment to reduce thermal losses. That's a huge thing that anyone who owns a building could do. I think one thing that people should think about is that storage is now becoming a much more viable part of the total energy transition equation. I mean, on the one hand, we've discovered in recent years that you don't actually need storage until you get to a pretty high degree of penetration of renewables on the grid. I think the IEA recently offered a report saying that with a more networked grid, you could provide like about half of total grid power without any particular storage. So it's when you get up to even higher levels that we need more storage. And people have said, well, batteries are too expensive and you can't do hydro everywhere and so on. That is now changing. We're seeing some real innovations happening in the storage market. We're seeing a lot of money coming into it, a lot of innovation, and we're seeing storage as a service. So in the same way that you can have a company put solar on your roof under the solar leasing model. Okay, so companies like Sunrun, Sungevity, Solar City, SunEdison, you can have them put solar on your roof without any money down and actually reduce your monthly bill a little bit. Okay, so it actually doesn't cost you anything to put solar on your roof. There are now companies that are doing that with storage, and they're doing it because they can allow, let's say, a commercial building to fill up their battery storage at night when power grid prices are cheap, and then draw from that instead of from the grid in the middle of the day when power prices are expensive. So there's actually a big arbitrage there, and these companies are able to take advantage of that arbitrage and actually put a reasonably sized battery array in a commercial building without it costing that business anything. So that's happening on the storage side. We've had some really interesting developments starting to happen in the lab, which are working their way to the commercial market in battery technology, but also in other forms of storage like compressed air energy storage and flywheels. You know, there's a real chance, like this recent report from the Rocky Mountain Institute suggested, that consumers are going to be defecting from the grid. It's like put some solar on the roof, put some batteries in the basement, and just disconnect. It's not impossible. I mean, it's been technically possible to be off-grid for many years, of course, but it's expensive. That's no longer going to be the case. It's no longer going to be so expensive. It's actually going to make good economic sense for a lot of people.
So to close out, what we're really seeing is rail explosions, coal ash spills, the dark side that maybe was pushed into other parts of the world that we didn't necessarily see in the United States of our reliance on fossil fuels is becoming very real and visceral to a lot of people. The effects of our fossil fuel infrastructure and consumption of fossil fuel resources. Are we really at an energy transition tipping point now? And if you were to project out an ideal Chris Nelder world of energy transition, what would that look like?
Well, yes, as I recently wrote, I believe we are at a tipping point. I believe we're at a point where renewables are going to continue to get cheaper. Fossil fuels are going to continue to get more expensive and more risky. People are going to continue to become even more sensitized to the risk of our fossil fuel dependence. And that's just going to continue pushing us to renewables. And I don't think that can be reversed. Not only have we seen all these different exploding trains full of crude oil, gas pipeline explosions. I mean, we just had another one this week, right, in New York City. A couple of people have died. Whole building blew up. A lot of that is just because of old infrastructure. We've actually seen a lot of natural gas pipelines explode due to old infrastructure. And we've got, all these coal ash spills, rendering water supplies unusable, contaminating rivers, and so on. So if you want to ask yourself, what does the future look like? Or why have we reached a tipping point? You should ask yourself, is any of this reversible? Are solar systems and batteries and wind turbines suddenly going to start getting more expensive again? And is nuclear and coal suddenly start going to get cheaper? No. Is there any reason to think that we're going to see fewer ruptures and spills from oil and gas pipelines, that we're not going to see more of these over 1,000 coal ash waste sites scattered around the U.S. having problems when a lot of these things have been sitting there for 30 or 40 years and people have sort of even forgotten about them because they're not even being actively filled anymore? No. Is there any reason to think that people in the developing world who still lack reliable power are going to continue turning to filthy diesel generators and kerosene lanterns? Or are they going to adopt these new little solar lanterns, which are now selling several million units a year worldwide? Absolutely. They love their little solar lanterns. They can't afford the cost of kerosene and diesel anyway. A lot of people have suggested that in the same way that Africa, for example, never just built out the old POTS telephone system, and instead they just jump straight to mobiles. Well, the same thing is going to be true for them with grid power. They're going to jump straight to small microgrids, small off-grid solar and wind-based systems. My call is the energy transition tipping point is here, and there's going to be no going back. It's hard to see when renewable energy is still just a few percent of global supply. And if you're not really paying attention to the trends, you could look at renewable energy and say, oh, well, it's just a few percent. Or you can look at energy efficiency improvements and say, yeah, well, it's still expensive. It's a couple points of ROI. It's not that interesting. Yeah, well, when you step back and you look at the trends, it's a whole different picture.